Alright, today we're going to do our tints and shades of our primaries and secondaries that we have listed here, and also our intermediates that we have listed here. I don't care which one you start with, as long as you make sure you're not doing orange, that you make sure it's on the correct row. So I'm going to do orange to start with, and the very first step, if you remember from before, is to do an underpaint. So I'm going to mix up an underpaint. So I'm going to get a full eyedropper of water on my plate, open my cup, get it of orange, get just a tiny bit of orange on my popsicle stick and mix it in with that water. Remember, underpaint is like a watercolor, so it's mostly water and just a little bit of color. But I don't want those chunks of paint to be left, so I got to make sure I get those all mixed in. I'm going to close my lid to my orange, wipe off my popsicle stick really well, make sure there's no paint left on it. Only a stain is fine. And I'm going to take a bigger brush, because I have to go all the way across all my oranges. Now again, if you are not doing orange, make sure you're on the correct row. So I'm doing orange, so I'm going to go across the orange here, get it completely covered up from edge to edge. I'm not leaving any white spots even inside on the edges. If it goes over a little bit, I'm not worried about it too much. I'm going to clean my brush out, wipe it off with my paper towel, and then I'm going to take and wipe out that underpaint. That way I can save my plate for when I actually go to paint other things. And then I'm going to go to, you would go ahead and do your yellow, your green, and your violet if you want. Otherwise you can do one row at a time too. I'm going to go ahead and do my underpaint for my blue-green. So my green is my lighter. So I'm going to get another full eyedropper of water on my plate. Open my green, get just a tiny bit of green paint on my popsicle stick, mix it in with that water till it's all mixed up, no chunks of paint in there. Wipe off my popsicle stick, close my green paint, and again I have a decent sized area, so I'm going to paint with my flat, bigger brush all the way across with that green, make sure I get it completely filled in. Now green doesn't like to mix with red and orange very well, so I'm going to be careful, a little more careful on where I put that green. I'm still going to go all the way to the edges, but try not to cross into the red-orange. And I'm going to wipe out my plate again with that paper towel, clean out my brush. I'm ready to start making my tints. So, going to start with the lightest value of paint, which in this case is white, because white is lighter than a color, and my instructions are to get 1 scoop of white and 1 scoop of color. So I'm going to get, with my popsicle stick, a scoop of white, and I'm going to kind of scrape it across the edge of the plate to make sure it goes down in that plate, so I get most of it. I'm going to close my white up unless I have to pass it on to somebody else at my desk. Clean off my popsicle stick really well, because I don't want to get white in my orange. And I'm going to open my orange and get a scoop of orange, put it directly in that puddle of white, lay my popsicle down long enough so that I can close the lid to the orange so it doesn't dry out or get spilled. And I stir with my popsicle stick. Always with my popsicle stick, I stir. I mix. And I keep a small puddle. I don't want to spread it out too far. For one thing, I don't want it to dry out, and the farther I have it spread out, the quicker it dries. And for another thing, I want to make sure my palette lasts as long as I can. I've got to keep mixing until I don't have any variations of values. Like, see, I have that darker orange right there. I've got to get that all mixed in. Run it across the edge there, mix that back in there. Now, you might use more white, you might use less white. As long as you got a scoop of white and a scoop of color, then you should be okay to paint with. So I'm going to wipe off my popsicle stick. And again, since this is a decent sized area, I'm going to use my bigger brush. If you don't feel comfortable with this big brush, you want to go with your medium size, then go for it. And I'm going to pull down, so just a little bit of paint on the tip of my brush, and I pull down. And if I want nice, neat edges, I'm going to turn my paper so that I can see my edges. So this is much thicker paint. This is what I expect to see for most of your stuff. The majority of your painting will be in this, unless you do palette knife. Very little is going to be left in underpaint, unless you do your dry brush on top or your Sharpie. Those will be left in underpaint. Everything else needs to be this thicker paint. Okay, so there's my first tint. Now I want to make a darker tint. So instead of starting over, I'm going to use that same puddle that I have left, and I'm just going to add more of my color to it. In this case, I'm going to add more orange, another scoop of orange. You can see that I have one white and two colors. If you don't already have a value mix, then yes, you could do one white and two colors. But I'm just going to make sure my popsicle stick is clean, scoop it up, and add it straight into that puddle. Set my popsicle stick down for just a moment so I can close my paint and get that mixed in. Again, as long as you have some white and some orange, and this is darker than your first tint, then you are okay. You could start out with two whites and one color and then add another color. Or add two more colors, as long as you have some white and some color, and always start with your white first for a tint. Always start with your white first for your tint. So I'm going to wipe off my popsicle stick. I didn't expand the puddle out at all, I kept it small. And I'm going to paint, wet brush. Just get a little bit of paint on the tip of my brush and paint the next section. Again, if you can't see your edges, turn so you can. Turn your paper so you can. Hey, you can see that I'm getting a little bit darker, but it's still a tint. I'm going to clean my brush out. Now this time I'm going to leave that puddle of paint on my palette. It's not worth it for me to try and clean it out because it's just going to smear all over my plate then, or my palette then, and I can't use the rest of the palette then. Okay, now the original comes straight out of the cup. So the original straight out of the cup. I'll go to a smaller brush so you can see me using it. I'm going to be nice and neat edges. If I pull down, and try not to press too hard because you don't want to smash the brush, so gently pulling down and turning the paper so I can see my edges. You can see that my flat brush, my bigger flat brush, was a lot easier to use for this section because it was a rectangle. Now obviously if it wasn't a rectangle it would have been a little bit harder to use, so I probably should have used something else like this. This is my number 8 brush. Finish filling it in. Clean out my brush. I'm going to leave my orange open, my paint open. And I'm ready to do my shades. Now my shades are a darker version of my color. So I'm going to start with the lightest version of paint. Your color will always be lighter than your black. Remember, black is a neutral. Your color will always be lighter. So using my popsicle stick, I'm going to get a good-sized scoop of orange. Now this time, I'm going to start a new puddle close to where I left off the other one. So I'm going to get a good puddle of orange. I'm going to close my orange, or whatever color you're on, close it so it doesn't get spilled or dried out. Clean off your popsicle stick as best as you can. You don't want to get color in your black. Now when you go to get black, notice that it says a half of a black, 0.5 black. That's because I don't want you to get too much black. So I'm going to open my black and get just the tiniest bit of black. It doesn't take much black to change it. I just have a little bit of black on the end down there. See if I can get it to focus. Might want to focus. See if I zoom in, you can see it. There we go. Now you can see it's just on the end down there. Barely anything. And I'm going to put that in that puddle of orange. I'm going to close my black. And I'm going to mix it with that orange. Now if you're doing orange, you're going to get kind of a brownish color. If you're doing yellow, you're going to get kind of a green, because that's what happens when you add black to it. And if you're doing green, you'll just get a darker green. If you're doing violet, you'll just get a darker violet. So a brown is a shade of orange. And yellow, just because of the pigments in the paint, just naturally changes to that gross looking green. You can't help it, that's just the way it is. If you get into art in high school, I'll show you how to make your yellow darker without using black. Okay, I'm going to clean off my popsicle stick. And I'm going to use my big flat brush, just because it makes sense to use it in that section. I get a little bit of that shade. And I'm going to paint my first shade of my color, which happens to be orange for this too. Try not to get it too thin. Try to be fairly neat. Just turn your paper so that you can see your edges. If it's looking too watery, then you're going to have to go over it a second time. Try to make sure you get an even value there. You don't want it to be darker in one area. Clean out your brush. That looks pretty dark up there on the screen, but it's actually not that dark. Now I'm going to go even darker, so I'm going to add a little more black. So I'm going to go back to my popsicle stick, open my black, get a tiny bit of black again on my popsicle stick. Just the tip of it in there. You don't need a scoop, you just put the tip of it in there, and I'm going to add it to that same puddle that I was working with for the shade. And you can see it's getting darker. If you compare what I had before to that one, it is darker. So now I'm going to wipe off my popsicle stick. I don't get the popsicle stick wet because wood and water don't like to mix. It'll split the wood. And I'm going to paint that shade, the darkest shade, in here as well. Now I could keep adding black. Yours might look almost completely black, which is fine. Turn it on its side. Whatever you ended up with, as long as I can see some of your color in there, it's fine. Now if you hold the paintbrush farther back, when you turn it, you won't get your hand in the paint. You won't be as likely to get your hand in the paint. Alright, so there is your first row of tints and shades. And now I want you to go on to do your other 3 rows. Make sure you do your underpaint first for all of them, and then you make your tints, paint your original, and then you paint your shades. Do not wipe out your plate once it's the thicker paint. Only wipe out the plate when it is the underpaint.